Hello, I'm Deborah Henley and I'm going to talk to you about what you can do to connect and engage with your audiences more quickly and to develop trust and loyalty more profoundly and to inspire and influence people more deeply. Would any of those three things be useful for you in your own business, and what difference would it make? I'm the author of Your Leadership Story, Use Your Life Experience to Influence and Inspire, and the Your Leadership Story workbook. And both of these show lots of tips and techniques for developing and using your story and unleashing the power of story in business. Now, we all know storytelling is very powerful. We've known it ever since we were young children. I remember those golden evenings when we'd draw the curtains and the sun would still be shining through, and my grandmother would sit on the side of the bed and tell me stories of dragons in the caverns of Carnarvon, and witches and fairies, and an old hobgoblin that would fish on the side of the river and pull up all kinds of magical things from underneath, and we'd be transported somewhere else. But the stories I loved best of all from my grandmother were the stories that she told of her time in Africa. Lesotho, Lusaka, Zambia, Zaire. All these names were like concoctions of magic that would make me think of other places far away. Now, she worked for Save the Children, and she would load up the rusty old Jeep with bags full of clothes and educational materials and medical supplies that had come in from all over the world. And off they would go in this Jeep, sometimes for 3 or 4 days and nights, up into the mountains to go and talk to the mountain tribes. And they would camp out under the stars, huge heavens full of wonderful stars. And then they'd finally arrive. And at one point she told me that she turned up in a village and they invited her in, sat her and her colleagues around the fire, and soon they were sharing stories from their own lives. This remote tribe were talking about their homes, their family lives, the things that were important to them, and they asked and wanted to know stories of the Western world, of buses and trains and conurbations. But what they found was the thing that they had in common were those things that matter to all of us as human beings, because stories transcend globally. They transcend across cultures, and stories connect each of us as human beings. What they also found through this storytelling was that it was a wonderful way of conveying information and knowledge from one tribal village to another. They could share medical information, educational information in the context of a story so that people better understood it. So what does that mean to us in the Western world? Well, I'd like to talk to you about the 7 C's of how stories can help. And you can use these 7 C's as a framework. So the first of the 7 C's is connection. Stories connect us from one to the other. Stories can be used so that people can trust you and understand you because they know who you are and where you're coming from. So I often recommend starting a talk, a presentation, a pitch with some form of connectivity that your audience can relate to. So I often tell stories about childhood, and that's what I've done today, because we can all relate to a child being children in one way or another. The second C is the C of credibility. So you can establish your credibility. You don't necessarily need to use your all your credibility. You don't need to present a list. You don't need to ram it home into people's faces. You can simply tell a story that demonstrates that you understand your product, your service, your area of expertise. And you can use a story of credibility to show how, if it's a product, how that product has been used by other people successfully. Those sorts of stories enable people to really relate to it and cut down barriers. Now, the third C is context. Stories give context and understanding. How is your product or service used? Where does this sit in their life? How can this be applied? So I've talked to you a little bit about how storytelling was used in the context of my grandmother's life out in Africa. But we can tell stories about how we can use storytelling day to day. Not just storytelling, but how we can use our products, our services day to day by telling stories that enable and develop understanding. So the fourth one is conviction. Stories convey real conviction and passion, and that enables people to trust you more. They trust what you're talking about. They trust your product because your story conveys your passion. And it also leads to this third one, influence and inspiration. When you tell your story, people know that you really care about it. When you tell a story and you share a story, people read between the lines, they read between the words, and they start to imagine what it might be like for them to be involved in this product or service, or in your life or in your world. The fifth C is the C of collaboration. So how does storytelling help with collaboration? When you tell a story, people want to come on board. If you tell a story well, if you tell a story in such a way that harnesses people's heart and mind and spirit, people want to get involved. It becomes a we, not an I did this and you can do that, but here's what we can all achieve together. So use storytelling and make them part of the story. Number 6, the 6th C is catalysation. So catalysation means to instigate some form of action. How do stories catalyse action? Well, often when you tell a story, you whet people's appetite, you get them excited about what next. You can, having contextualised your product or service, you catalyse their action because they want to know how they can get involved in the next part of the story. You begin to tell a future story, and people want to get involved in that. And it's been shown anyway that through some research done by Deborah Small at Wharton, who is an economist, and she's also somebody who deals with consumer behaviour, that when people use storytelling and they use a narrative, people begin to care. So, for example, Save the Children released an app where they put lots of statistics about starving children and, the horrors that were taking place in statistical form. And Deborah Small's analysis found that people would start to switch off. They are actually less caring when they read statistics. But when a story of one child was told, one individual child, then the amount people would donate went up to 6-fold. And it's the same when we talk about particular incidences. If you have had some personal connection with an experience, or you understand the backstory of something, you get engaged, you become loyal to it. You want to be part of that story. And that leads us on to the 7th C, which is community development. Now, this is something that Apple in their day were absolutely brilliant. I'm not saying it's not their day now, it's brilliant. I'm a great Apple user. But Apple in their day, when Steve Jobs was alive, were fantastic at creating community. It is not the product or the service that you're selling. It's not you that you're selling either. What you're selling is the dream. You're selling what your customer wants to do next. And when you use a story, you are selling that dream. What Apple did was that they talked about thinking differently, about being part of the rebels and the misfits and the creatives who thought differently. They created a community of many different people. It's a little bit like, if you've seen the Life of Brian film, everybody stood around going, we're all not the same. And they were a community group of people who were not the same. So that's the end of the 7 C's. And these are the things to unlock the story of the power of storytelling. You can use these 7 C's as a framework to remind you they are 1, connection, 2, credibility, 3, context, 4, conviction, 5, collaboration, 6, catalysation, and 7, community. You can use these all 7 as a framework when giving your presentations and pitches, or you could just go long on one of them or another of them. If you'd like to know more, having learnt what the 7 C's are, you'd like to learn how to use them, and you'd like to learn how to tell a story in a really powerful way, then get in touch with me, Deborah Henley, or sign up. There's many more. I run lots of courses and workshops on unleashing the magic of storytelling.